So I talked about our work at Knocknashee in this venue before, in 2017, I believe, based on an excavation grant we held at that time. And while I'm presenting the paper here on my own, this is a joint endeavor with my colleagues Linda Boutoil and Cormac McSparran from Queen's. So the work we've undertaken so far comprises an initial survey campaign from 2016 and then an excavation in the interior, focusing on the Roundhouse occupation on that summit plateau in 2017. And I already presented that in some detail in a previous talk here. I'm going to recap some of this, but mainly the new elements here that I'm going to present are from post-excavation work that was conducted subsequently to the talk I gave here in 2017. And I will also incorporate results from two much more limited fieldwork campaigns, 2020 and 2021, which were kindly funded by Sligo County Council, but the radiocarbon dates from that formed, radiocarbon dating that formed part of the post-excavation work from those two campaigns, were part of the funding we received from the generous funding we received from the Royal Irish Academy. So, yes, I can do that. I think, is that better? So, before the start of our project, the earliest evidence known from the summit plateau of Knocknashee Hill were those two Neolithic cairns. At least one of them definitely is a Neolithic cairn. The chamber, the capstone of the chamber, is exposed, and you can even, if you're a small build, you can squeeze yourself in these days. The second one, well, being slightly familiar with Slieve Gullion, I'm not entirely convinced it couldn't be an early Bronze Age cairn rather than a passage tomb. But there we go. That's a discussion for another date. And our field work did not focus on those two structures. What we were looking at in our field work was a system of enclosing banks that encloses most, or essentially all of the summit plateau, undated at the time, but that have since the 1990s been interpreted as a late Bronze Age hillfort, and the Roundhouse occupation on the summit plateau, that some of which already featured in the first edition Ordnance Survey maps, and you can see how prominently some of these Roundhouse features there beyond that first cairn are visible in this oblique aerial photography. And there's also some evidence of later, most likely post-medieval structures that we were trying to establish a context for. The initial research questions for the survey work we conducted back in 2016 was, how many archaeological structures exactly are there on the summit plateau? What is their morphology? How many different types of structures can we identify? And what is the spatial relationship between those structures and those different types of structures and the topography of that site? So this digital terrain model shows the results from that survey work. So we were able to bring up the number of definitive Roundhouse footprints from 30-ish to a minimum of 51, with another 16 or so potential Roundhouse footprints. So almost twice the number, or potentially even more than twice the number known previously. A number of other features, D-shaped enclosures that abut against that outer perimeter. Now, not the outer, the inner perimeter wall or perimeter bank, so presumably are later, and a few rectangular structures which are presumably of post-medieval date. Yes, and so here again, in a nutshell, also we were able to establish that a roundhouse is a prehistoric roundhouse clustered into groups, and we presented a tentative interpretation of that clustering in our preliminary reports. One of the we were also able to document the somewhat unusual dish morphology of one of the two cairns, which is one of the reasons why I think it might actually be post-Neolithic, but again, that's a discussion for another day. Then in 2017, we came back to the site to open up a trench, a cutting across three of the roundhouses in the center of the summit plateau to establish the age of those structures. Are they, as Michael Herity, who had a very brief go at the site in the early 1970s, are they, as Michael Herity thought, the dwellings of the cairn builders, or are they indeed later? Are we dealing with a Bronze Age hill fort, which in that case would be, relatively unusually densely built up? What are the functions of these roundhouses? Did they serve as dwellings? Were they inhabited all year round on a temporary basis? Is there any evidence for any kind of industry? Why would these roundhouses have been built in such an exposed location? And what's their relationship with the cairns and the other structures on the hill, and the enclosures, and mainly the perimeter banks? And also, ultimately, last not least, what would the environment have looked like at the time, and how did it change? And yes, here you've got a magnetic susceptibility map with the with our initial cutting, 36-meter cutting, 1 meter wide, placed across three of these roundhouses, 18, 19, and 20, and then subsequently enlarged to 4 meter wide at both ends of the trench in the areas of houses 18 and 20. And here you've got the excavated section of house 20. You've got the wall footing there, two stone facings, so to speak, on the inner and outer edge of this footing, with packed soil and stones in between. And you can also see an entrance situation there. This is, in comparison, this is house 18, still under excavation in this photograph, and you can see that the walls are much less well defined. It became apparent during the excavations that a lot of stones already seem to have been removed, robbed out at some point in the past, presumably already during prehistory, although we were not able to put an exact date to that. The robbing out of stones here, but it just offers a tantalizing glimpse at the fact that not necessarily all of the roundhouses on the summit plateau would have been occupied, or would have been in existence even coevally at the same point in time. In terms of the radiocarbon dates, I'm just showing the late bronze. The vast majority of radiocarbon dates from the 1917 excavation fall into the late Bronze Age, 12th to 9th centuries BC. So the heyday of Bronze Age hillfort construction in Ireland. No surprise there. This was more or less what we had expected. There's no evidence of any Neolithic building activity or otherwise activity from any of those three excavated roundhouses. There are a few later dates, one from the late Iron Age, the remainder post-medieval, but not related to any structures. In the excavation of House 18, we also found some redeposited Mesolithic flints, so there clearly is, but no dates to go with these. So there clearly was earlier activity on the hill, even predating, presumably, the building of those cairns. And then we also took 2 monolith block cores from close to our 2017 cutting. And we were, of course, hoping to get a pollen sequence that goes back at least to the Bronze Age, if not the Neolithic. That doesn't seem to be the case. There's still some issues with the dates and the age modeling for that sequence. But on present evidence, all we've got in the sequence that we've been able to document is a very nice pollen sequence, but one that only goes back to about 8300. So, the tail end of the late Iron Age. And it looks as if the hilltop at this point was already covered by heather. There is some evidence for woodland involving mainly hazel, some oak, some holly, and mind you, this is towards the peak of the late Iron Age lull, when you would expect peak not reforestation, peak forest recovery. But we're dealing with a largely open landscape. So unfortunately, up to this point, we haven't been able to push back that paleoenvironmental sequence into prehistory proper, so to speak. There is some evidence then for woodland clearance throughout the early medieval period, and interestingly, cereal pollen indicators would seem to suggest that in the late medieval or early post-medieval period, we have some cereal agriculture in the close vicinity to from where the pollen cores were taken. So either on the summit plateau or on the upper parts of the slopes, those slopes that were not too steep to prevent any agricultural use. So the research questions that we took to the 2017 excavation, we were able to date the roundhouse occupation, at least the 3 roundhouses that were partially excavated. They're invariably late Bronze Age. Their function, apparently they served as dwellings. There is some artifactual evidence, a handful of pottery sherds. There is some chert/flint, some ground stone tools, very, very little. We haven't found any hearth features, but then we haven't excavated the center of any of those houses. And in terms of the environment, we still can't say for the late Bronze Age and also not for the Neolithic, but at the start of the paleoenvironmental sequence that we have, already in the early first millennium AD, we seem to be dealing with a mostly open, only sparsely wooded landscape around the site. Now, so much for the roundhouse occupation of the summit plateau. We still had to answer the question of how the roundhouse occupation relates to the enclosing banks and bank features. Are they contemporary with the roundhouse occupation, and were the inner and outer bank, so the outer bank only exists on the alongside the eastern slope. The northern, southern, and western slopes only have a single bank sitting right on the edge of the summit plateau. Were those 2 banks constructed at the same time as part of a system of staggered lines of defense, and what were the methods of their constructions? So here you can see where we put down a 30-meter cutting across both the inner and outer bank in 2020. And at the bottom you have, prior to the start of our excavation, the town and boundary wall sitting on top of what we at that point still believed was a prehistoric earthen bank. That's a quarry scoop sitting just behind the end of our trench. And moving on here, you can see the turf and topsoil removed, and in the foreground here of the upper left-hand picture, you're looking at the limestone bedrock. So that dry stone wall is actually sitting on the very edge of the limestone bedrock, which means it is not sitting on an earlier earthen bank. What looked also to ourselves as an earthen bank up to that point really seems to be tumble from that dry stone wall on which a turf had developed. There is no earthen bank on the edge of the plateau at the point where we put that cutting down. I'll come to the dating of the feature later on. This is a somewhat messy looking view of the section, and again you can see that it sits on it goes through the mock bank, false bank, right down to the limestone bedrock. And here you can see our 3D model of this entire 30-meter trench. The remainder of the townland boundary walls there at the top. Then you've got a scree. Then you've got this lower terrace, which sits about 10 meters below the edge of the plateau, which is almost stone-free. And then the lower so-called bank on the downhill slope edge of that plateau. And now to the radiocarbon date. So we've got one radiocarbon date from a piece of charcoal that was recovered between the stones of the lowermost tier of the dry stone wall of the upper non-bank, which gave us a Viking Age date, which was surprising. And before anybody gets too excited, from the same layer, not directly associated with a piece of charcoal, but also between the stones of the lowermost tier of that dry stone wall, we also found a bit of aluminium foil from what appears to be a cigarette wrapper of sorts. So, and the stratigraphy, if you want to call it that, the layer, perhaps 20 centimeters or so, sitting above the bedrock and below the turf abutting against that wall, contained one or two Neolithic flints, some painted earthenware, 19th, maybe early 20th century, glass fragments of soda bottles, fence nails, and barbed wire fragments, all in the same intermingled layers. So no proper stratigraphy. And yes, the radiocarbon date from a bulk sample from the body of the lower bank produced this intriguing late glacial date, which almost certainly has nothing to do with, so it's not charcoal, it's a bulk date, nothing to do with any anthropogenic activity. If it provides information on anything, then probably soil formation processes after the retreat of the glaciers from this part of the island. So we discussed this with one or two of the members of the survey team that in the early 1990s identified Knocknashee as a probable Bronze Age hill fort. And they did point out, this point taken, that because you have this quarry scoop right at the back of the trench, it couldn't be ruled out that there might have been some relatively modern interference that might have removed any evidence of prehistoric enclosing features, or ensured that we just picked a bad spot for this trench. So fair enough, it's always possible. I think I've already run through all of this. We went back the following year, in 2021, to see if we could detect evidence for man-made defensive rampart in a better preserved section of the inner perimeter bank than the one excavated in 2020. So the outer bank, I think, this no doubt, this is a clearance feature. It's nothing to do with defensive works enclosing a Bronze Age hill fort. But, you know, the inner banks looks rather more substantial in some other parts of the summit plateau. Here, down there on the right-hand side, you can see where we put down our 2021 trench, which was much shorter than the trench of the previous year. And again, here down to the limestone bedrock, and you can see the rampart composed of boulder clay, essentially, there in the background. Again, a 3D model here. There were no structural features, you know, no post holes, no timbers. It was, you know, just your jumble of clay and stones. But we did find a piece of charcoal right on top of the bank at the interface between the boulder clay and the overlying turf, giving us a Neolithic date. So if that is a piece of charcoal from the top of the bank, then that bank can't be late Bronze Age. And we, you know, after we took all these nice pictures, we hacked a substantial hole into this bank, and it really rather seems to us a boulder clay feature, potentially of glacial origin as well, not a man-made structure at all, but enhanced to look as a bank-like anthropogenic feature by the removal of material from the alongside the inner face of that bank, essentially a quarry trench, from which presumably stones were removed to build that dry stone wall, that townland boundary wall. So what we're left with is what looks like a nucleated late Bronze Age settlement like Roundhouse agglomeration, but unenclosed. It's not a Bronze Age hill fort, and everybody who's ever listened to any talk by Billy O'Brien on his excavations in Bronze Age hill forts will know if you've got any artifactual record at all, it's unlikely to be one, except if it's Rascala or Hochis Fort. Where does that leave us? It leaves us in a place where Knocknashee aligns, although it's not a Bronze Age hill fort, aligns rather well with places like Mullafarna, also in South County Sligo, or Turlock Hill in the County Clare Burren, both of which have massive roundhouse agglomerations, but no enclosing features whatsoever. Turlock Hill, excavations a few years ago by Rosso Malduin here in the audience have produced a couple of late Bronze Age dates. Mullafarna has some late Bronze Age, also some Middle Neolithic dates. So it's a category of site that I think we need to do more field work on, but also quite a lot more of thinking about in order to figure out what these actually are. Because they're not Bronze Age hill forts. Thank you for your kind attention.